the official record of the Halvari contact event, filed under Diplomatic Incident Register 7741 Kappa, classified Joint Intelligence Grade 2, lists the duration of the exchange as 11 hours and 43 minutes. It lists the outcome as contact normalized, posture adjusted, no casualties, treaty pending. It lists the lead human representative as Captain Aldrich Sorn of the UN's survey cruiser Ardent Meridian. In the summary paragraph, in the careful language that joint intelligence prefers, it notes that the Halvari Sovereignty and the United Earth Naval Service reached a mutual understanding of standing and capacity, and that formal diplomatic proceedings were initiated within 60 days of the incident's conclusion. What the record does not say, because records of this kind never say the human parts, is what it felt like to sit across a resonance table from a species that had been engineering the subjugation of civilizations for 400 years. Accept a gift from them with both hands as protocol required and feel absolutely nothing happen. My name is Petravaska. At the time of the Halvari contact event, I held the rank of lieutenant commander and the post of intelligence officer aboard the Ardent Meridian. I was 39 years old. I had spent 11 of those years in the intelligence division of the Naval Survey Corps, the last 4 of them doing exactly this kind of work. Sitting in small rooms on the edges of known space, reading the people on the other side of the table, and sending back reports that told the Navy what it was actually dealing with. I am writing this account because the official record, accurate as it is on the facts, omits the thing that mattered most. The thing that the Halvari miscalculated. The thing that in the end changed the posture of an entire sovereign civilization in 11 hours and 43 minutes without a single weapon being fired. They gave us a gift, we kept it. I want to explain what I mean by that. The Ardent Meridian was not a warship. I want to be precise about this because it matters to the story. She was designated a survey cruiser, which in naval parlance means she was built for extended independent operations at range. Long legs, good sensors, a crew of 112, a medical bay that could handle anything short of full surgical theater, and enough cargo volume to sustain a cultural exchange mission for 18 months. She was armed, as all survey vessels are, but the armament was secondary, tucked into the hull behind panels you would not notice unless you were looking for them. From the outside, she looked like what she was advertised to be, a vessel of inquiry, not of war. What the outside did not show was her escort. The Naval Survey Corps operates on a doctrine that was codified after the Dravathi event, which most people have heard of in the broad strokes, and the Varathari event, which most people have not. The doctrine is simple. No survey vessel crosses an uncharted sovereignty threshold without 2 stealth-capable support hulls standing off at sensor horizon range. The support hulls carry no diplomatic function. They carry no crew that will ever appear in an official register. They exist for one reason only, and that reason is never stated in any document that the other side of a contact table will ever read. I knew the support hulls were there. Captain Sorn knew. The 6 other officers who composed our contact team knew. The 105 crew members who were not part of the contact team did not know and did not need to. The Halvari did not know, or rather, they believed they did not know, which, as I will explain, turned out to be a different thing entirely. We had been tracking the Halvari Sovereignty for 4 years before the contact event. Not openly, not provocatively. The Naval Survey Corps does not announce its interest in a new civilization, but carefully, methodically, from the distances that sensor technology permits and curiosity requires. What we had assembled in those 4 years was a portrait of a civilization of considerable sophistication and considerable appetite. The Halvari were bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, approximately human in gross morphology except for the secondary cranial structure, a bony plate, that swept back from the skull's crown and gave their heads the appearance of something permanently braced against a forward wind. Their skin was a deep blue-gray, their eyes amber yellow with vertical pupils, and their voices carried in a register that human hearing processed as a low harmonic thrum beneath the translated words. They were old, not ancient in the sense of the archive species, not millions of years old, but old enough to have left ruins on 7 different worlds that were not their homeworld, and to have no obvious memory of why those ruins existed or what they had been for. Their history, as best our analysts could reconstruct it, stretched back approximately 60,000 years of continuous civilization, with 2 major extinction-adjacent collapses that they had climbed back from with a patience and a grimness that our xenosociologists found both admirable and troubling. What troubled them most was the pattern of those collapses. Both times, the Halvari had nearly destroyed themselves, not through external conflict, but through internal fracturing, a recurring tendency to produce, in times of civilizational stress, charismatic unifying figures who resolve the fracture by directing the civilization's attention outward, toward expansion, toward acquisition, toward the systematic absorption of adjacent species. It was not conquest in the crude sense. The Halvari had never, as far as we could determine, destroyed a species they encountered. They absorbed them. They brought them into the sovereignty structure through a process that their own records described as integration, and which our analysts, reading between the lines of a great deal of very careful diplomatic language, described more plainly as the removal of the absorbed species' capacity for autonomous decision-making at the civilizational level. The mechanism of integration was what had caught naval intelligence's attention 3 years before the contact event, when one of our long-range sensor drones had intercepted a Halvari communications packet, and our cryptographic division had spent 18 months breaking it. The packet contained technical documentation. I am not a neurologist. I am not a biochemist. I can read a technical document in my professional capacity, which means I can understand the function being described without necessarily understanding all of the underlying mechanism. And what the documentation described was a delivery system, a biological delivery system, something that could be introduced into a sentient organism's neurological architecture through a medium that the organism would receive willingly, ideally would receive with gratitude, and which would, over a period of weeks, restructure certain key pathways in the organism's higher cognitive function. Not destructively, not crudely. The Halvari were not interested in lobotomies. What the delivery system restructured, as best our neurological consultants could interpret, was the architecture of group decision-making, the capacity of a species to collectively decide, as a species, to refuse, to resist, to say no to an authority that presented itself as benevolent and necessary. After integration, a species could still make individual decisions. They could still eat, work, form relationships, conduct daily life, express preferences about small things. What they could not do, without experiencing a cascade of neurological distress that their own bodies would interpret as catastrophic wrongness, was collectively organize against the sovereignty that governed them. They called the delivery substance, in their own language, something that our translators rendered as the clarifying gift. We called it something else in our briefings, but I will not write that word here, because this is an account I intend to be read. The question that naval intelligence had been working on for 2 years before the contact event, and which I had been assigned to as the point officer for the Ardent Meridian's mission, was this: how did the Halvari administer the clarifying gift to a new species? The technical documentation described the mechanism. It did not, in the portion we had intercepted, describe the delivery context. It did not explain how they got the gift into the hands or the bodies of a species they were meeting for the first time. The contact event answered that question. We made our approach to the Halvari threshold on a standard diplomatic vector: transponders active, communications open, velocity reduced to what the Naval Survey Corps manual describes as demonstrably non-aggressive, which in practical terms means slow enough that any sensor array worth the name could track you, read your power signature, and determined that you were not angling for a weapons solution. We had been broadcasting our intent for 6 days before we crossed the threshold, using the standard interstellar contact protocol that the Corps had been refining for 60 years. And for the last 3 of those 6 days, the Halvari had been broadcasting back. Their initial response had been, in the Corps' contact taxonomy, a Category 3, formal, structured, neither warm nor hostile, carrying the precise syntax of a civilization that had done this before and had protocols of its own for managing the encounter. They requested our designation, our civilizational status, our estimated population, and our governing structure. They did this in a sequence that our analysts noted, with some interest, was exactly the sequence described in the technical documentation as the preliminary assessment phase, the data gathering that preceded a determination of integration suitability. We answered truthfully, because truthful answers in the preliminary phase cost us nothing. We were a species of approximately 12 billion, governed through a federated council structure, possessed of interstellar capacity for approximately 200 years. All accurate, all information they could have derived independently through patient sensor work at range, and probably had. What we did not tell them, because they did not ask, and because the contact protocol does not require volunteering information that has not been requested, was anything about our military capacity, about the 87 survey cruisers, 14 heavy destroyers, and 4 fleet carriers that compose the Naval Survey Corps' first contact-capable force structure, about the support hulls standing off at sensor horizon range, about the fact that the Ardent Meridian's crew had been specifically selected, among other criteria, for neurological baseline profiles that our medical division had reason to believe were relevant to the mission. I will come back to that last point. The Halvari directed us to a way station, a structure they called the threshold of meeting, which translated somewhat awkwardly but carried the sense of a liminal space, a place that was neither fully sovereignty territory nor fully external, and we docked at the designated berth on the 4th day after initial contact. The way station was large enough to be impressive, without being large enough to be threatening, which I recognized as a deliberate calibration. It was staffed by a delegation of 11 Halvari, led by a figure whose title translated as Sovereign Emissary, a small and very composed individual named Halvari Sovereignty, whose amber eyes moved over our contact team with an expression I had learned, from the briefing materials, to associate with the preliminary assessment phase, careful, measuring, and patient in the particular way of someone who believes the outcome is already determined and is merely waiting for the process to confirm it. Captain Sorn led our team. I sat at his right hand. Beside me were our diplomatic attaché, our chief science officer, our medical officer, and 2 ensigns whose primary qualification for the contact team was their facility with the Halvari language. They were, along with being genuinely gifted linguists, also the 2 crew members with the most comprehensively documented neurological profiles in our medical division's records. I will come back to that as well. The first 3 hours of the exchange were exactly what the contact protocol predicted, and what I had read about in 100 debrief files from prior contact events, formal introductions, cultural exchange, the careful, graceful, mutually flattering performance of 2 civilizations presenting their best selves to each other, while each quietly assessed what the other was, what they wanted, and how much of a problem or an opportunity they represented. The Halvari were good at this. Halvari Sovereignty was, I will say without reservation, one of the most accomplished diplomatic presences I have encountered in my career. Composed, attentive, warm in a way that felt entirely genuine until you remembered what the technical documentation had described, and then felt like something else entirely. At the end of the 3rd hour, Halvari Sovereignty said that the Sovereignty wished to offer a gesture of welcome. This was the moment. I had been briefed on it. Captain Sorn had been briefed on it. Our medical officer, Commander Yen Rath, had spent the better part of 2 years preparing for it. The gesture of welcome, described in the technical documentation as the offering of the clarifying gift, was, in the form we had anticipated, a beverage, a ceremonial drink presented in a specific vessel with specific language at a specific moment in the exchange. The documentation had described it as a near-universal component of Halvari First Contact Protocol across all 9 species they had previously integrated. We had debated extensively what to do when this moment came. The argument for refusal was obvious. You do not accept a neurological delivery system from a civilization you have reason to believe intends to use it against you. The argument against refusal was more complicated, and in the end it was the argument that prevailed. Because it was my argument, and because Captain Zorn trusted my read on the operational situation, and because the 2 years of neurological preparation that Commander Wrath had conducted had produced a result that changed the calculus entirely. The argument was this: refusal told them something. Refusal told them we knew. Refusal collapsed the preliminary phase and moved us immediately into a posture confrontation for which we had very little useful intelligence about, their response doctrine. And refusal, most critically, denied us the data we needed. The confirmation that the delivery mechanism was what we thought it was, which we needed for the intelligence record, and which we needed in order to understand, as fully as possible, exactly what the Halvari were before we determined what our posture toward them should be. Acceptance, on the other hand, told them nothing they did not already believe, and the 2 years of neurological preparation that Commander Wrath had conducted had given us not certainty, but a very well-founded confidence that what we were accepting would do nothing to us. I will explain why. Human neurology is, by the assessment of every xenobiologist and comparative neurologist our medical division has access to, unusual. Not unique in the galaxy, the survey record contains several species whose cognitive architecture shares some of our distinguishing characteristics, but unusual enough and unusual in enough specific ways that it has been a consistent subject of interest in the xenobiology community since we first had enough contact data to do the comparison. The particular characteristic that is relevant here is what our neurologists describe as the redundancy architecture of human collective resistance pathways. Most intelligent social species, the ones we know of, the ones the survey record documents, develop their collective decision-making architecture around a relatively centralized model. There are specific neural structures and specific neurotransmitter systems that govern the capacity for group cohesion, group resistance, and group refusal, and those structures and systems are, in evolutionary terms, relatively concentrated and relatively accessible to interference. This makes a kind of sense from a pure efficiency standpoint. A centralized system is faster. It is more responsive. It is more easily coordinated. What human neurology developed, for reasons that our evolutionary biologists have been arguing about for decades, and which I am not remotely qualified to adjudicate, was not a centralized system. It developed something closer to, and I am borrowing this description from Commander Wrath, who used it in her briefing and who will forgive me if I simplify, a distributed mesh. The human capacity for collective resistance, for group refusal, for the organized, sustained, multi-generational project of saying no to a power that calls itself inevitable. That capacity is not located in a specific structure or a specific neurotransmitter system. It is woven into the architecture of human cognition at a level so fundamental that you could not remove it without removing the cognition itself. It is, in Commander Wrath's words, not a feature we developed. It is what we are. I have thought about this for years, and I want to record what I understand of it, because I think the understanding matters beyond the context of the contact event. The species in the Halvari's integration record, the 9 civilizations that had accepted the gift before us, were, by the profiles our xenobiologists had assembled from the sovereignty's own accessible cultural documentation, all fundamentally social species. All had developed complex group decision architectures. all had what our neuroscientists would describe as identifiable loci of collective volition, specific findable places in the architecture where the signal for group action was generated, where the consensus impulse was concentrated before it propagated out to the individual members of the group. This is not a deficiency. It is a common and logical evolutionary solution to the problem of coordinating large numbers of individuals with competing immediate interests toward a common long-term goal. It works. It has worked for hundreds of species across every survey boundary we have mapped. What humanity developed was different, not because the goal was different. We needed to coordinate. We needed to build consensus. We needed to act collectively across large populations. But because the path we took to that goal was shaped by a history that favored a specific kind of redundancy, our historians and evolutionary biologists argue about the precise sequence of pressures that produced it, and I am not going to adjudicate those arguments here. What Commander Rath's analysis established was simply the neurological fact: the human capacity for collective resistance is not located anywhere. It is everywhere. It is in the architecture the way grain is in wood. Not something added to the wood, but the pattern by which the wood grew. You cannot remove it by targeting a structure. You cannot suppress it by disrupting a pathway. To remove it, you would have to remove the wood itself. The Halvari's delivery system was designed to target specific structures in a specific kind of neurological architecture. The centralized kind, the normal kind, the kind that most of the species they had encountered possessed. It was, by any reasonable assessment, a superb piece of biological engineering. Precise, elegant, calibrated for minimal disruption to everything except the specific pathways it was designed to restructure. The problem was that we did not have those pathways, not in the form the system was looking for, not in the locations the system was targeting, not in the concentrations the system required to do what it was designed to do. Commander Rath had been careful in her briefing to note the limits of her analysis. She was working from intercepted documentation, not from direct examination of the delivery system's biological payload. Her models were built on comparative neurological data, not on experimental verification. There was a confidence interval around her conclusion, and that confidence interval mattered, and we had discussed it extensively in the weeks before we crossed the threshold. But the confidence interval was high. The structural mismatch between the delivery system's targeting architecture and human neurological organization was not a marginal mismatch. It was, in Rath's assessment, a categorical one. The kind of mismatch that arises not from two systems being similar but slightly different, but from two systems being built on entirely different organizational principles. She had compared it, in a moment of unusual informality for a briefing of that gravity, to designing a key for a specific type of lock and then encountering a door that had no lock at all, not a different lock, not a harder lock, but an entire absence of the locking mechanism, because the door was built on a principle that did not require one. The gift needed a lock to work on. We did not have one. That was the fact. 11 years of intelligence work have trained me to hold facts without decoration, and that fact, plain and large and exactly as strange as it sounds, is the one I have held closest since the contact event. Commander Rath had spent 2 years confirming this, working from the intercepted technical documentation, running modeling studies, consulting with a small group of neurologists and xenobiologists at Naval Medical who had been read into the intelligence picture. Her conclusion, delivered in a briefing 3 weeks before we crossed the threshold, was precise and was the most important thing said in any room I was present in during the entire period of my career. The clarifying gift, as described, will have no neurological effect on a standard human cognitive architecture. There is no compatible receptor pathway at the delivery targets. The biological payload will be processed and cleared by normal metabolic function within 48 to 72 hours. The most likely subjective experience for the recipient is a mild stimulant effect from the delivery medium, itself possibly a transient headache and nothing else. She had paused after delivering this and then added, "The Halvari, based on everything we have read, do not know this. There is no indication in any of the documentation or the contact record that they have previously encountered a species with our specific neurological architecture. They will administer the gift. They will expect it to work. And when it does not work, when they check for indicators of the compliance response in the subsequent hours and find nothing, they will be confronted with a situation their protocol does not have a prepared answer for. That, I had told Captain Sauron after the briefing, is the contact event, not the gift. What comes after? Doret Solvan presented the gift in a vessel of carved pale stone, filled with a liquid that was a deep amber color and smelled faintly of something I associated with warm wood and rain. There was language, formal, careful language, delivered with a gravity that I recognized as genuine on Solvan's part. Because I think Doret Solvan genuinely believed, in that moment, that they were offering us something valuable. The documentation described the Halvari's relationship to the clarifying gift in terms that suggested they did not frame it to themselves as subjugation. They framed it as stabilization, as the removal of the chaos variable that, in their own history, had twice nearly destroyed them. From the inside of that frame, I think the gift genuinely felt like a kindness. I thought about that later. I thought about it for a long time. Captain Sorn received the vessel with both hands, as the contact protocol required for offered objects, and drank. He passed it to me, and I drank. It moved around the table, the diplomatic attaché, the science officer, Commander Wrath, the two linguist ensigns. Each of us received it and drank in the sequence the Halvari expected. It tasted like the amber liquid smelled, warm, slightly sweet, with a faint bitterness at the back of the palate. The stimulant effect Commander Wrath had predicted was real. I felt it within 20 minutes, a mild sharpening of attention, the kind of clarity you associate with a good cup of coffee on a cold morning. By the 2-hour mark, I had a mild headache, exactly as predicted, which I noted in my internal log and set aside. Doret Solvan watched us. I had been watching Solvan watch us since we sat down, which is, in one form or another, the fundamental skill of intelligence work. And I want to be precise about what I observed in the hours after the gift was given, because this is the part of the contact event that the official record summarizes in a single careful sentence, and which deserves considerably more than that. In the first hour after the gift, Solvan was composed and attentive in the way they had been throughout, warm, engaged, leading us through a discussion of cultural exchange that was interesting and clearly genuine in its curiosity about humanity. But beneath the composition, in the small calibrations of posture and the micro-adjustments of expression that I had been briefed to look for, there was a quality of waiting, a patient, satisfied, utterly confident waiting, the quality of someone who has laid a foundation and is simply allowing time to pass while it sets. At the 2-hour mark, the quality changed. I caught it first. A fractional hesitation before Solvan answered a question from our diplomatic attaché, a question about governance structure that should have produced an immediate, prepared, flowing answer of the kind Solvan had been producing for the previous 5 hours. The hesitation lasted perhaps half a second. Then the answer came, fluent and warm as always, but the hesitation had been there, and I noted it. At the 3-hour mark, the quality of the waiting had become the quality of someone running a mental calculation and finding it isn't producing the expected result. I want to be careful here. The compliance response that the Halvari's delivery system was designed to produce, based on the technical documentation and on Commander Wrath's analysis, would have been subtle in its early manifestations, not immediately visible as subjugation, more like a gradual softening of posture, an increasing deference to the sovereignty's framing of questions, a reduced tendency to push back or introduce competing interpretations. The Halvari, watching our contact team in the hours after the gift, would have been looking for the beginning of that softening. They were not finding it. At the 4-hour mark, our diplomatic attaché, Ren Vale, a woman of considerable experience and a dry, precise intelligence that I had always respected, made a comment about the sovereignty's governance structure that was not, in the most literal sense, impolite, but which was not deferential either. It was the kind of comment that a human diplomat makes when they want to establish that they are paying close attention and that certain framings have not gone unnoticed. It introduced into the warm and smooth surface of the exchange a small, hard fact. The fact was this: Vale had observed that the sovereignty's documented relationship with the 9 species listed in their accessible cultural record appeared to involve a degree of administrative integration that was, in her assessment, somewhat more comprehensive than the term sovereignty usually implied. She said this with the same calm that she brought to everything, and she smiled when she said it, and she waited. Darret Solvan was still for a moment. Then Solvan smiled back, and it was, I noted, a different smile than the ones that had preceded it. There was something in it that I did not have a clean professional category for. Not hostility, not panic, something more like recalibration. The expression of someone who has just discovered that the room they walked into is a different shape than the room they expected. Your civilization is thorough, Solvan said. We try to be, Vale said. I was watching Solvan's hands. In the briefing materials, the xenobehavioral notes on Halvari body language had flagged the hands as a primary indicator of cognitive processing. Load, when a Halvari was managing an unexpected variable, the hands moved, small adjustments of the secondary finger joints, rapid enough to be barely visible and slow enough to be unconscious. Solvan's hands were moving. The exchange continued. The surface of it remained smooth. But something had shifted in the room, something that I suspect Solvan was experienced enough to feel but not certain enough to name. And the shift was this: the direction of inquiry had reversed. For the first 5 hours, the shape of the exchange had been, very slightly, the Halvari asking questions and our contact team answering them. Not obviously, not crudely. Solvan was too skilled for anything as naked as an interrogation. But the flow of information had a current to it, and the current had been running toward them. Normal for a first contact exchange, expected. The species that knows more about the territory has a natural advantage, and our policy is to let that advantage run for as long as it is useful, because a species that believes it is in control is a species whose authentic responses you can read. After Vale's comment, the current stopped running. What followed, for the next 2 hours, was something I have rarely experienced in 11 years of contact work. A completely open and completely honest exchange between 2 civilizations that had each, in different ways and for different reasons, already shown the other something real. We had shown them that we knew what the gift was. Not by saying so, we never said so, not in that room, not in that meeting, but by the simple fact of not changing. By continuing to be, in the hours after the gift was administered, exactly what we had been before: precise, attentive, unhurried, capable of the small, firm, unalarmed introduction of inconvenient facts. They had shown us that they were intelligent enough to read that, to understand what the absence of change meant, to move from the frame of patient confidence into something more honest, something that, by the 7th hour of the exchange, had the quality of a genuine conversation between 2 parties who were deciding, in real time, what the other one was and what that meant. I want to be honest about Darret Solvan. I spent 11 hours and 43 minutes in that room with them, and I was watching them with every analytical tool I had developed over 11 years of professional observation. And my assessment was this: Solvan was not a simple instrument of sovereignty policy. They were a person of considerable intelligence, and underneath the protocol and the patient confidence and the very skilled performance of benevolent authority, a genuine and unsettling curiosity. And what they became curious about, as the hours went on and the gift produced no effect, and Vale continued to introduce small hard facts with her characteristic dry precision, was us. Not in the predatory way, not in the we must now assess and recalculate way, though that was certainly also happening. in the more fundamental way that I associate with a mind encountering something it did not know existed, and finding it, despite everything, interesting. At the 7th hour, Solvan asked us, directly, the diplomatic framing mostly dropped by then, the conversation having moved somewhere more honest than either side had probably planned, why we had accepted the gift. Captain Sauron looked at me. This was the moment we had discussed, the answer we had prepared. I gave it because it was my operation, because we were curious what you would do when it didn't work, I said. There was a silence, long enough to be significant. You knew, Solvan said. We suspected, I said. We wanted to confirm, and now you have confirmed. Yes. Solvan was quiet for a moment. Their hands had stopped moving. Not because the processing had resolved, I thought, but because the situation had moved beyond the kind of calculation that hand movement indicated and into something else, something that required a different kind of attention. The gift works, Solvan said. It has worked with every species we have offered it to. We believe you, I said. We are not most species. Another silence. Longer. No, Solvan said very quietly. You are not. What followed the 7th hour was the most direct exchange I have participated in during my career, and I want to record it as accurately as I can, because what was said in those hours, and what was not said, will matter to the diplomatic record for a long time. Solvan, once the frame of the preliminary protocol had been set aside, was methodical. They wanted to understand what had happened, not just tactically, in the sense of the gift failing, but structurally. How had we known? How long had we known? What did our knowing imply about our intelligence capabilities? What did our acceptance of the gift, knowing it would fail, imply about our operational posture? We answered some of these questions and declined to answer others. And the pattern of our answers and declinations was itself an answer of a kind. We were not hostile. We were not alarmed. We were not, Solvan could see, improvising. We had arrived at the threshold of meeting with a prepared position, and that position had not been destabilized by anything that had occurred in the preceding 7 hours. And this fact, more than anything we said, was the data point that I watched Solvan process slowly, with the kind of care that only a very intelligent person applies to something they did not expect to find. You have been watching us for some time, Solvan said at the 8th hour. Long enough, Captain Sauron said. It was the first substantial thing he had said since the conversation had shifted, and he said it with the quality of a man who is content to let others speak until the moment when a single sentence is worth more than a paragraph. And you still came. Yes, knowing what the gift was, knowing what we intended. Knowing what you intended for species whose neurology makes your approach viable. Soren paused. He was not a man who used pauses for effect. He used them because he thought before he spoke, and the thinking took time. We do not represent a threat to you, emissary. We are not here to prevent you from governing your sovereignty. How you govern the civilizations within your sovereignty is for now your concern and not ours. We are here because we are here, because you are on the map, because we go where the map has edges. Solvan absorbed this. And the 2 vessels standing off at sensor range, Solvan said, they are also simply because you go where the map has edges. There was a moment. Our contact team did not react, none of them, and I was proud of them for that, because the confirmation that the Halvari had located the support hulls was a data point of its own, and how we received it mattered. Yes, Sauron said, they have not moved since you docked. No, they will not move unless I ask them to. And if I were to ask, what would it take for you to ask them to move? The question had several possible meanings, and Soren understood all of them. Nothing has occurred in this room that would cause me to ask them to move, Soren said. Nothing that I anticipate is likely to occur that would cause me to ask them to move. We are here to talk. We would prefer to leave with the shape of a conversation that makes future conversations worthwhile. That is, as far as I can determine, all either of us wants from today. Another silence. Solvan's hands were still. You are a very unusual civilization, Solvan said at last. We have been told, Soren said, the gift failing that has never occurred. In 400 years of contact work across 9 integrations, the gift has never failed to produce the compliance response in a subject population. Then we are glad to have provided you with novel data, Vale said, with the particular inflection she used when she was being precise and dry in equal measure. Something shifted in Solvan's expression. It took me a moment to name it, and when I named it, I was not sure I was right, but I think I was. What I saw, beneath the recalibration and the careful intelligence and the professional composure of someone managing a situation they had not prepared for, was something that in a human face I would have called, with some hesitation, relief. I thought about it later. I thought about what it would mean to spend 400 years doing a thing you had told yourself was a kindness, and then to sit across a table from a species for whom the thing simply did not work. To find, at the end of 400 years, that the category you had built your entire external policy around, the category of species whose architecture was compatible with the gift, had an outside, that the frame had edges, that something existed on the other side of those edges that had come to the table anyway, without alarm, without aggression, without being destabilized by a thing that would have reshaped 9 other species, and was sitting there being precise and dry and unhurried and inviting you to a future conversation. I am speculating. I cannot know what Daret Solvan felt in that room, but I know what I saw. We left the threshold of meeting after 11 hours and 43 minutes, and the Ardent Meridian broke dock and moved back to the contact vector approach lane while the 2 support hulls came in from sensor range to take their escort positions, visible and unambiguous, and close enough that the Halvari way station's own arrays could log their class and armament without any difficulty. This was not an accident. The support hulls had standing orders to make themselves visible on our departure, at whatever distance and angle would allow the Halvari to read them clearly. Not threateningly. They were in formation, not on an attack vector, and their weapons were cold, but visible. The logic was simple and was part of the operational planning I had submitted and Captain Soren had approved 3 months before we crossed the threshold. It cost us nothing to be seen, and what the Halvari saw when they saw those ships, their class, their armament, their quiet, patient, unhurried positioning, was additional information about the civilization they had just met. Information that should, in our assessment, produce a considered response rather than an aggressive one, because what the formation communicated was not threat but competence, not the posture of a species that was trying to intimidate, the posture of a species that simply was what it was and had no reason to pretend otherwise. The official communication we sent as we broke dock was brief. It used the formal register of the Interstellar Contact Protocol, and it extended our thanks to the Sovereignty for the exchange, noted that we had found it substantive and illuminating, and indicated that the United Earth Naval Service looked forward to future conversations at a time and in a format that the Sovereignty found convenient. The phrase I had insisted on including, against the mild objections of our diplomatic attaché who found it unnecessarily direct, was this: we note that today's exchange has provided both parties with relevant information about the other's characteristics and capacities, and we believe this information provides a sound foundation for a relationship of mutual clarity. Mutual clarity. That was the phrase. Vale had found it too blunt. I had argued that bluntness was exactly right, that the Halvari were intelligent enough to understand precisely what it meant, and that understanding precisely what it meant was the point. Soren had agreed with me. On the transit back to the survey boundary, 8 days, nothing to do but think and write and run the debrief with the contact team. I wrote my intelligence assessment. It was the longest document I had produced in 11 years of intelligence work, and I will not reproduce all of it here, but I want to record the core of it, because the core is what I believe matters and what the official diplomatic record does not capture. The Halvari Sovereignty was not, in my assessment, an existential threat to Earth or to the expanding sphere of human-contacted civilizations. They were a sophisticated, old, expansionist power with a very specific and very successful method of civilizational management that happened to be entirely non-functional against human neurology. The failure of the gift was not, I assessed, something they had encountered before, and the implications of that failure, as experienced by an intelligent, senior sovereignty diplomat in real time, would require significant time to work through their institutional and doctrinal structures. What I recommended was patience and consistency, continue contact, be what we are. Do not overstate our capacity or our intentions. Do not understate them either. Allow the Halvari to draw their own conclusions from observable evidence, because the conclusions available to them from observable evidence were already more useful to us than anything we could assert. And do not, under any circumstances, pretend that the gift had done anything. Never raise it directly, the framing that Emissary Solvan had moved to, in the later hours of the exchange, was one that allowed the subject to be set aside with dignity intact on both sides, and that framing served us well. But never pretend, never soften the data point of what we were. The data point was simple. The gift did not work. We were what we were before it. We were what we were after it. We had come to the table knowing what the gift was and had accepted it anyway. Because we were curious, and because we were not afraid of it, and because the absence of fear was itself information that we judged it useful for the Halvari to have. The report ran to 67 pages. Its classification was Joint Intelligence Grade 2, which meant it would be read by approximately 300 people in the Naval Survey Corps and the Diplomatic Service and the Intelligence Division and the offices of the Joint Council of Earth. Its conclusion was 3 sentences. I am aware that 3-sentence conclusions are unusual for 67-page reports, but the 3 sentences were the only part that I believed needed to be remembered, and I wanted them to stand alone. The sentences were, the Halvari Sovereignty has spent 400 years building a model of how civilizational contact works. Today, they discovered that the model has an outside. The appropriate response is to give them time to think about what that means, and to continue being the outside. The formal diplomatic normalization proceedings began as the official record notes, approximately 60 days after the contact event. They were conducted by a team from the Joint Diplomatic Service, a team that did not include me. My function was intelligence, not negotiation, and they went on for 18 months and produced a framework treaty that I am told is solid if cautious on both sides. I was not present for those proceedings. I was on the Ardent Meridian, which by then was 3 survey boundaries away, running a preliminary contact assessment on a civilization we had recently identified that the records called, in the provisional designation, the Sovereignty Cluster. I heard about the normalization later, in fragments, through the intelligence traffic that crosses my desk in the ordinary course of operations. What I heard suggested that the Halvari delegation had arrived at the normalization proceedings with a posture that was, in the diplomatic services assessment, significantly more careful and significantly more honest than the posture of the preliminary assessment protocol, that Direct Solvan had led the Halvari delegation and had, by accounts I found credible, pushed for the framework's language to be more precisely mutual than sovereignty doctrine normally produced, that the treaty contained, in its preamble, a section that is not legally binding, but that sets the tone for everything that follows, a phrase that our translators rendered as parties of established nature, which is not a phrase that appears in any previous Halvari treaty. Parties of established nature. The Halvari had a category for species whose nature the gift had disclosed, made knowable, made clear. They had made a new category for a species whose nature the gift had failed to alter, and in the failure had disclosed something different. We were not the species they had expected. We were the species we were. I have been asked, in the years since the contact event, by people who know enough of the classified record to ask the question intelligently, what I think the most important moment in the exchange was. They usually expect me to say the moment the gift was administered, or the moment emissary Solvan confirmed they had located the support hulls, or the moment Soren said nothing has occurred in this room that would cause me to ask them to move, or the moment Vale introduced the first hard fact. I say none of those. They were all important, but they were all consequences of a decision made 2 years before the Ardent Meridian crossed the threshold. In a briefing room at Naval Medical, when Commander Rath finished her 67 pages of neurological analysis and said, "There is no compatible receptor pathway at the delivery targets." The most important moment, I tell them, was the moment we understood what we were. Not what we could do, not what we had built, not what we had the capacity to threaten or to destroy, but what we simply, structurally, at the level of architecture, were. The Halvari had given a version of the gift to 9 species and reshaped what those species were capable of being, collectively, from the inside out. They had done it carefully and in good faith, as best I could tell, within their own frame of understanding. And their frame was not entirely wrong for the species they had encountered, because those species had centralized systems and accessible targets, and the gift had worked exactly as designed, and the record of those integrations was a record of smooth, stable, permanent administration. And then they had tried it on us, and it had done nothing, not because we had defended against it, not because we had a countermeasure, or a prepared response, or a superior technology, because the target it was looking for was not there, because what the gift needed, a centralized, accessible pathway of collective resistance, a specific location in the architecture where the capacity for group refusal was concentrated and could be reshaped, we simply did not possess, because the thing it was trying to remove was not a feature of us. It was what we were made of. I am not a philosopher. I am not a neurologist. I am an intelligence officer, and my habit of mind is to deal in facts and in their implications. But there are moments in this work when a fact is large enough that it demands something more than a professional register. And this is one of them. For as long as human civilization has existed, longer than recorded history, longer than the oldest story, all the way back to whenever it was that we first became the thing we are, we have been, as a species, in an argument with power. Not one argument. 1,000,000 arguments in 1,000,000 contexts across 1,000,000 generations, never entirely won and never entirely lost, always renewed, always continuing. The argument about who gets to decide, the argument about what authority is and where it comes from and when it can be refused. The argument that every person who has ever stood up in a village meeting or a council chamber or a field or a street and said, "This is not right, this is not how it will be," every person who has done that has been making, in their own small way, the argument that there is a thing in us that cannot simply be administered away. Commander Rath's analysis put a neurological description on something that I think we already knew. The thing in us that cannot be administered away is not an attitude. It is not a tradition. It is not a political value that a good enough argument or a strong enough incentive or a clever enough delivery mechanism could displace. It is the architecture. It is what the mesh is made of. The Halvari had spent 400 years developing a tool that could reshape that architecture in other species. They had met 9 civilizations and integrated 9 civilizations, and all 9 of those civilizations had had a place in their structure where the tool could find purchase. We were the 10th, and the tool had found nothing. The Ardent Meridian's contact team did not celebrate the outcome of the Halvari exchange. That is not a statement about how we felt. I am not sure what a statement about how we felt would accurately say, because what we felt was something I do not have a clean single word for. Something between satisfaction and solemnity, the satisfaction of a plan well executed, and a result that matched the analysis. The solemnity of having spent 11 hours and 43 minutes in a room with a civilization that was, in its way, trying to do a thing to us that had been done to 9 other species, and having simply, quietly, without spectacle, not been done to. We had a meal together, the contact team, on the evening after we broke dock. Soren opened a bottle of something from his personal stores, a dark red wine from a province in southern Earth that I had not had before and will not forget. He poured 7 glasses and set them on the table and sat down without ceremony. We drank. No one made a speech. Soren was not a speech-making man, and we were not, any of us, a speech-making group. What we were was tired, set, and quiet. And something else that I am going to describe as steady, the specific quality of steadiness that comes not from an absence of difficulty, but from having encountered difficulty and found that you were equal to it. I should record, for the accuracy of the account, what the debrief looked like in those 8 days of transit, because it was not all wine and quiet meals. There was work, a great deal of work. Each member of the contact team produced a written account of their observations and submitted it to me for incorporation into the intelligence assessment, and those accounts were detailed and precise, and in the case of Commander Rath's medical observation log, ran to 31 pages, covering every micro-indicator of the gift's administration and the subsequent hours. The 2 linguist ensigns, Cadet Male Dorrant and Cadet Sarah Voss, both of whom had demonstrated a composure during the exchange that I noted formally in my assessment of the mission, produced linguistic analyses of Solvan's speech patterns across the exchange timeline that were, I thought, the most granular and most useful single documents in the entire package. They had been listening for things that the rest of us, fluent but not native in the nuances of the Halvari language's register shifts, had missed, and some of what they had caught was significant. What Dorrant's analysis noted was that Solvan's register, the formal distance built into the grammar of their diplomatic speech, had contracted measurably across the exchange. In the Halvari diplomatic language, as our contact linguists had established, the formal diplomatic register involves specific grammatical choices that create distance between speaker and subject, a kind of grammatical deference structure that operates in both directions, elevating the subject and maintaining the speaker at a managed professional remove. Solvan had used this register precisely and consistently throughout the first 5 hours of the exchange. By the 7th hour, when Solvan had asked us why we had accepted the gift, the register had shifted to something Dorrant classified as the Halvari personal professional mode, still formal, but carrying the grammatical signatures of genuine cognitive engagement rather than performed authority. By the 9th hour, in the moments when the exchange had been most direct, the register had contracted to something our linguists described as near collegial. They had not expected to end up in a collegial register with us. No protocol had prepared them for it. The shift had happened because the situation made anything else feel, I think, insufficient. Voss's analysis focused on a different aspect, the specific vocabulary Solvan had used to describe us. In the early hours, the term used in the formal Halvari diplomatic register to describe a new contact species translated as something between young civilization and unestablished power, not contemptuous, just positional. By the later hours, the term had shifted. The word Solvavan was using translated differently, depending on how you parsed its root morphology, and Voss had parsed it carefully. The closest rendering she produced was something like, a power of uncharted depth. I wrote that phrase in my own notebook and kept it. A power of uncharted depth. That was what Solvan had arrived at by the 9th hour as the best available description for what we were. Not a young civilization, not an established one, not a threat or an opportunity or a subject for integration. Something whose depth they had not measured and whose bottom they had not found. That seemed right to me. That seemed like the beginning of an honest relationship. 2 parties who had agreed, implicitly, and without anyone using those words, that they would deal with each other as things whose depth had not been measured and needed to be respected for that reason. Vale, who had a habit of filling silences with observations that cut directly to the center of things, said, "They'll need time. They'll have it," Soren said. They built a lot on the assumption that it would work. Most things that work for a long time get built on, Soren said. That doesn't mean they can't be rebuilt. I thought about Darat Solvan sitting in a room on the threshold of meeting after we had left, working through the implications of 11 hours and 43 minutes. I thought about what it would cost a mind like that. Careful, intelligent, genuinely curious, capable of more honesty than the protocol required, to carry back to the sovereignty what had happened and what it meant. I thought it would cost something. I thought it would also be, for a mind like that, the most interesting problem they had encountered in a long career. We were the outside of their model. That was not nothing. In my experience, the outside of a model is where the most interesting things live. After the meal, I went to my station and opened my intelligence file and wrote the last entry of the contact event record. It was brief. It was not classified, or rather it was, but only at the level that my personal log entries carry as a matter of standing protocol, not because the content required it. The entry read, "The gift did not work. We were what we were before it, and we are what we are after it. We came to the table with our eyes open, and we left with the data we needed, and the shape of something that may, in time, become a real relationship between two civilizations that now know what the other actually is." In 11 hours and 43 minutes, no weapon was raised, no threat was made, no ultimatum was issued, and no concession was demanded. We sat in a room with a species that had a very specific idea about what contact with a new civilization meant and what the outcome should be, and we simply, by being what we are, made that idea insufficient. I do not know what the Halvari will do with the knowledge they took away from today. I do not know what their doctrinal review will produce, or how long it will take, or what the framework they eventually build will look like. I know that they are intelligent, and that they are old, and that they have resources and institutional memory that we do not yet have, and I know that the history of the sovereignty is not an innocent one. But I also know what I saw on Darat Solvan's face in the 9th hour of the exchange when the surface of the protocol had been mostly set aside, and what remained was two people in a room working out what was true. What I saw was the expression of someone looking at the outside of a frame they had believed was the whole world. We are what we are. We were what we were before the gift was offered, and we are what we are now that it has been kept, metabolized, cleared, gone without a trace, and the thing it was looking for was never there to begin with. They gave us a gift, we kept it, and what keeping it turned out to mean was this. We were not altered by it. We were not diminished by it. We were not reshaped by it into something more convenient for someone else's idea of how a civilization should be governed. We were simply, stubbornly, structurally ourselves. We sat across the table from something that had reshaped 9 civilizations, and we absorbed it the way a sea absorbs a stone, without drama, without spectacle, without the stone leaving any permanent mark on the water. And then we finished our drinks, and we asked for future conversations, and we went home. That is the contact event. That is what the official record, in its careful language, does not say. What it does not say is the part I needed to write down.